For 80 years, the BBC World Service has been broadcasting around the world.
From Dire Dunia to NewsHour.
From Daraklar to World Have You Say.
From Dunida Yamanta to Outlook.
From Noktat Hiwar to The Strand.
Today on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service at 16 hours GMT. This is Oliver Conway with World Briefing. Coming up, North Korea has agreed to suspend uranium enrichment and long-range missile tests. We get reaction live from Washington. Also today.
This is what Assad just chilling. Oh my God.
The Syrian military is reported to be carrying out a ground offensive against rebels in the city of Homs. After the phone hacking scandal here in Britain, Rupert Murdoch's youngest son James steps down as head of News International. And later.
As to programmes, don't expect too much in the early days. The programmes will neither be very interesting nor very good.
After a modest start, we celebrate the World Service at 80. First, the latest from the Bush House newsroom.
BBC News with Charles Carroll. North Korea has announced that it will halt its uranium enrichment programme and suspend nuclear and long-range missile tests. Steve Kingston reports from Washington.
This announcement follows talks between American and North Korean officials in Beijing. In a written statement, Victoria Nuland of the US State Department said the North Koreans had agreed to suspend uranium enrichment at the Yongbyon nuclear plant and to allow UN inspectors to return to the site. In return, the US is offering 240,000 tons of food aid. It's come 2 months after the death of North Korea's long-standing leader, Kim Jong-il. The question now is whether his son and successor, Kim Jong-un, will engage in broader talks about disarmament.
The US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton described North Korea's move as a modest step in the right direction. There are reports from Syria that a ground offensive on the country's third-largest city of Homs is underway. Baba Amr has been under bombardment for nearly 4 weeks. Jim Muir is monitoring events from neighbouring Lebanon.
Communications with Homs and the beleaguered Baba Amr quarter seem to be almost entirely cut, so it's hard to know exactly what's going on there. Many reports from activists had said there had been more very heavy bombardment by the encircling security forces using artillery, mortars and tanks. One activist told Reuters news agency a ground offensive by government troops had begun. A Syrian government official in Damascus also told the Associated Press that an attack was underway and that the whole area would be cleaned within a matter of hours.
The European Central Bank has said it's making $712 billion available to Eurozone banks in a second major refinancing operation. About 800 banks will borrow from the ECB for 3 years at interest rates of 1%. More money has been lent to more banks than in the first round of the scheme, but Christian Schulz from Berenberg Bank says the scale of the loans is not necessarily bad news.
The fact that more banks have accessed the funds and that they've asked for more money as well means that the stigma attached to this emergency liquidity facility is not so high. It's quite likely that this time it's not the need, this time it's really the opportunity that drove the number, and therefore it's a positive signal, and the ECB is not going to allow that to go on forever.
A BBC correspondent says banks will use the cash to make payments on their own debts as well as lending money to Eurozone governments. The Indian economy has experienced its weakest growth in nearly 3 years. Economic figures show that India's GDP fell from 6.9% in September 2011 to 6.1% in the last 3 months of the year. Analysts say that high interest rates, a slowdown in manufacturing and mining sections and corruption has contributed to the fall. The next budget will be presented to Parliament in March. World News from the BBC. Rupert Murdoch's son, James, has stepped down as the head of News International, the British newspaper publisher which has been tainted by its association with phone hacking. A statement said James Murdoch would take on a role at his father's News Corporation in New York. The hacking scandal forced News International to close its biggest-selling paper, The News of the World. Naomi Grimley reports.
Ever since the phone hacking scandal broke last summer, James Murdoch has been struggling to contain the damage to News International's reputation.
The 39-year-old son of Rupert Murdoch had to appear twice before British parliamentarians to explain that he'd had no knowledge of illegal practices at the News of the World. But some of the newspaper's top lawyers contradicted his account and said they had warned him of how widespread phone hacking had been.
Thousands of students across Spain are staging street protests against government cuts in education spending. One of the main protests is in Barcelona, where students broke into a local radio station and read out their demands on air. The authorities in China's ethnically divided western region of Xinjiang say a total of 20 people died on Tuesday in violence near the city of Kashgar. The regional government said a group of what it called terrorists armed with knives attacked people on a busy shopping street, killing 13 people. It said 7 of the attackers were shot dead by police. Doubts have emerged over the identity of a man arrested after flying into Cairo airport, whom Egyptian officials said was a leading figure in Al-Qaeda. The Egyptian authorities identified him as Saif al-Adel, who's on the FBI's most wanted list for alleged involvement in bombings in East Africa and the September the 11th attacks on New York. However, the man himself denies he's Saif al-Adel, and some counter-terrorism experts have also expressed doubts. And that's the latest news from the BBC in London.
Hello, you're listening to World Briefing from the BBC World Service with Oliver Conway. And in the next 25 minutes, we'll hear from Cairo for more on that confusion over whether a suspect arrested at the airport is a senior Al-Qaeda leader or a critic of the organisation. Plus, is it unpatriotic to strike during the Olympics? But first, just over 2 months after the death of its leader Kim Jong-il, North Korea has agreed to suspend uranium enrichment and stop nuclear and missile testing. As part of a deal announced simultaneously in Pyongyang and Washington, the US says it's ready to send nearly 250,000 tons of food aid to North Korea. The official North Korean news agency said the authorities were keen to maintain a positive atmosphere following recent talks with the US, the first since Kim Jong-un took over as North Korea's new leader. This was the reaction a few minutes ago from the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
The United States still has profound concerns, but on the occasion of Kim Jong-il's death, I said that it is our hope that the new leadership will choose to guide their nation onto the path of peace by living up to its obligations. Today's announcement represents a modest first step in the right direction. We, of course, will be watching closely and judging North Korea's new leaders by their actions.
The US and others have been trying to get North Korea to abandon its nuclear program for years without success. Well, let's find out what they're making of this in Washington. Our correspondent there is Paul Adams. And Paul, first of all, what exactly have the North Koreans agreed to?
Well, according to the State Department, it includes a moratorium on long-range missile launches, on nuclear tests and nuclear activities at Yongbyon, the main nuclear facility in North Korea, and that includes uranium enrichment. It's also, according to the State Department, agreed to the return of IAEA inspectors to verify and monitor a moratorium on enrichment activities and confirm the disablement of a 5-megawatt reactor and associated facilities. So, as you just heard from Hillary Clinton, a modest first step in the right direction, something that we thought we were on the verge of late last year before Kim Jong-il died. And perhaps reassurance that in the immediate aftermath of his death, diplomacy can still yield results. And what will the US do in return? Well, it's a modest move. It is a guarantee to provide about 250,000 metric tons of nutritional assistance. This is not quite the same as food aid, although I noticed from the State Department briefing notes that there is the prospect of additional assistance based on continued need. So clearly, as far as the food-starved North Korean regime is concerned, this does offer the prospect of a fairly substantial move towards assisting in a very, very critically needed area. And that cautious reaction from Hillary Clinton because North Korea has in the past made promises which it hasn't kept. Yeah, because we've been here before many times, because the whole process of trying to get the so-called six-nation talks, essentially talks about disarmament in return for aid, back on track has proved a very difficult one. Those talks were suspended in April 2009. There have been frequent persistent attempts to get them back on some kind of level keel. It now looks as though that might become a possibility. And of course, for President Obama, in an election year, it's perhaps one less bit of nuclear anxiety for him to worry about.
Paul Adams in Washington. The authorities in Syria say they are engaged in a final effort to crush what they describe as gangs of armed terrorists in the city of Homs. Parts of the city have been under fierce bombardment for more than 3 weeks after anti-government fighters resisted attempts to dislodge them. An activist near the Flashpoint district of Baba Amr posted a video online this morning as sounds of heavy gunfire came from nearby.
This is what Assad cannot control it anymore. He's just chilling. Oh my God.
Well, the same activist later told the BBC what had been happening.
Today in the morning, we woke up under heavy attack, heavy shelling on Homs. Most of these shellings going to Baba Amr and Al-Rifai area, and some of them to Kerm Zaytoun. Snipers shouting like crazy from the morning. Really, they are trying to attack all area in Homs, not only Baba Amr. But Baba Amr, it's a very close area, and they are attacking it very well.
Let's speak to our correspondent Jim Muir, who's following developments for us from Beirut. And Jim, can we be sure that this long-promised ground assault is underway?
That seems to be what officials in Damascus are indicating. Unusually, they've been saying to journalists, but kind of off the record, not with their names on it, saying that there is a big offensive underway, that it should be over in a matter of hours, that they're mopping up operations, having more or less overrun the area, and so on. And from Baba Amr itself, there are reports, obviously communications are cut, so there's been very patchy flow. In fact, you can't call it a flow. Very little information coming out, but one of the main activist organizations, which normally is a major source of information, finally, after a long silence, produced one short dispatch saying that there was heavy shelling going on and that Syrian army forces were trying to attack Baba Amr along several axes or on several fronts. Other activists have been quoted as saying that there has been an attack, but it's been repelled, so that would give a different version of events, obviously, than that being given by officials in Damascus. But it does seem that there is certainly an attempt to go into Baba Amr. Whether it is a final all-out push, I'm afraid we'll just have to wait and see.
We saw those difficulties in getting the wounded journalists out of that area. Are there any escape routes for fighters or indeed civilians trapped?
I think those escape routes have been slowly being closed down. It seems the impression is that forces have been tightening their grip under these blankets of shelling over the past more than 3 weeks now, kind of almost like salami tactics, moving in and stopping up all the possible gaps. So I think getting in and out was always dangerous, and now it's become perhaps so dangerous as to be almost impossible.
And we're hearing that the UN aid chief, Baroness Valerie Amos, has been denied permission to go to Syria.
Yes, perhaps not very surprisingly, really, because the UN Human Rights Council meeting was stomped out of by the Syrian envoy on Monday, Tuesday, and the Syrians basically regard the UN as more or less an organization that's been taken over by the Americans and their allies. So they regard, I would imagine they would have regarded her mission as basically hostile, and obviously it's no great surprise that they haven't given her a visa.
Jim, thank you. Jim Muir there, live from Beirut. Now, as you may have heard in the bulletin, News International, the British newspaper publisher, which has faced criticism over a phone hacking scandal, has announced that its chairman, James Murdoch, son of Rupert Murdoch, has stepped down. A statement said James Murdoch would take on a role at his father's News Corp in New York, focusing on its international television business. Here's our business reporter, Mark Gregory.
James Murdoch's resignation from the top job at News International will be seen as another effort at damage limitation for a company mired in scandal. The problem started with revelations that journalists at the Sunday tabloid paper The News of the World had used phone tapping to get stories about the private lives of celebrities. Several senior figures at News International have been arrested, although so far none have been charged. The News of the World closed several months ago, but since then there have been allegations that similar practices were common at other Murdoch-owned British newspapers, notably the flagship daily tabloid The Sun. A public inquiry into media standards taking place in London has heard months of damaging testimony, including most recently claims of corrupt payments to police officers involved in high-profile cases. James Murdoch has repeatedly denied any knowledge of the practices used by journalists. But as the allegations have multiplied, it's become harder to sustain the line that he was completely unaware of a culture of low ethical standards. His departure comes shortly after News International launched a Sunday edition of The Sun to fill the gap left by the closure of the News of the World. Mr. Murdoch says the company he leaves is in a strong position from the successful launch of The Sun on Sunday and new business practices in place across all its titles.
Staying in Britain, and senior politicians have strongly criticised a threat from one of Britain's biggest trade unions to strike during the Olympics. In a newspaper interview, the leader of the Unite union, Len McCluskey, said the union was looking at the leverage the Olympics might provide for protesting against cuts in public spending. The Prime Minister's office said the threat was completely unacceptable and unpatriotic. Here's our political correspondent, Rob Watson.
Len McCluskey is the leader of Britain's biggest trade union. He's now sparked a political storm after suggesting the possibility of strikes during the Olympics and even civil disobedience to protest against cuts in public spending. The Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, said people would be stunned by his threat.
I just think people would be sort of gobsmacked, appalled that someone thinks that at a time when we're finally hosting one of the greatest events in the world, he's calling for civil disobedience. And I know he's the sort of paymaster of the Labour Party, but I hope Ed Miliband will rein him in.
The opposition Labour Party has indeed moved quickly to distance itself from its biggest donor. The party's deputy leader, Harriet Harman, said Mr McCluskey had already been spoken to.
We all need to be actually rallying behind the Olympics. It's going to be an important opportunity for Britain, and it's going to affect our jobs, our economic growth in the future and the prosperity of this country. So we want to make a great success of it, and I've already had the opportunity of saying to Len, I think that he was wrong even to raise this.
Public reaction has also been broadly hostile to the threat of strikes, whatever the grievances of the unions and despite the unpopularity of spending cuts.
Meanwhile, students in Spain are holding mass demonstrations against crisis cuts in government education spending, which are hitting schools and universities. In Barcelona, students broke into a local radio station before reading their demands on air. In Madrid, several thousand took to the streets, among them this student union leader.
Today, the student union has called for protests against the state in more than 40 cities to show that students in Valencia are not alone. We have felt attacked and hurt because the state of cuts in the country is the same in Valencia as it is in Madrid, Barcelona or Murcia. We don't accept that we have to pay for a crisis we haven't generated.
Well, Valencia is one of Spain's worst affected regions, with regional government debt and resulting lack of payments leading to a chronic funding shortage in education. From Valencia, here's Tom Burridge.
Valencia's historic centre has filled with students, a seemingly never-ending line of young people marching in support of public education in this part of Spain. There have been several demonstrations in Valencia over the past few days. This is more of a carnival atmosphere, a marked contrast to last week. Then the police went in heavy-handed. They were widely criticised in Spain, and it fueled bigger demonstrations on subsequent days. Today was less about the police and more about the people's anger over cuts to public education and a lack of funding for the region's schools. Over the past few months, many public schools in Valencia have been short of money because the regional government has failed to pay them on time for their maintenance costs. One of Valencia's main issues is its debt, which currently stands at more than 20 billion euros. The regional government says it needs to cut teachers' wages as part of wider reforms to public services. It aims to balance its budget by 2014, but wiping out its debt will take much longer.
That report from Valencia by Tom Burridge. And some news just in. It has just been announced in Egypt that presidential elections will be held on the 23rd and 24th of May. These will be the first since Hosni Mubarak stepped down as president last year. A second round will take place in June, with final results released on the 21st of June. Now, today here at Bush House, as it can't have escaped your notice, we have been marking the 80th anniversary of the BBC World Service. It began as the Empire Service and was launched by the BBC's then Director General, Sir John Reith, with a live address that he had to deliver 5 times to reach time zones around the world. And he was rather cautious of the Empire Service's initial quality.
As to programmes, don't expect too much in the early days. The programmes will neither be very interesting nor very good.
And here's a little flavour of some of our earlier programmes.
Through one of the marvels of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my people throughout the empire.
Now here is a statement in French of great importance to our French listeners by General de Gaulle.
Le gouvernement français, après avoir demandé l'armistice...
Good morning from London. This is the BBC broadcasting to Latin America in Spanish.
Esta es la BBC de Londres.
I never really felt that I was alone all the time, partly thanks to the BBC, which kept me in touch with the rest of the world.
And in case you're wondering why this is the first World Briefing of the day, it's because there have been special programmes produced live from large tents in the central courtyard of Bush House. Our British Affairs correspondent Rob Broomby has been taking a look.
Welcome to everyone. The purpose of this meeting is very, very simple. We're trying to shape the BBC Global News agenda.
The World Service News Day started with a show of transparency. The morning editorial meeting, normally held in private, was broadcast live. That and many of the programmes throughout the day came from a specially erected tent in the courtyard. Some of the 27 language services and the English output under one canvas roof and broadcasting side by side. The idea was to involve the global audiences in a discussion about the future of the World Service and international broadcasting generally. Steve Titherington, the senior commissioning editor for news and factual programmes, said the aim was to discover what listeners want in the future.
We're not looking for answers on the day. It'd be great if we got them. But my feeling is this is a day which is sort of feels like we're turning a corner. Great conversations lead to kind of friendships, understanding, which then build. And I think we have a very strong relationship with our audience, and you can see that in the tweets and the comments people are putting on. But I think that there's still space to grow there, and I think that's the kind of big challenge for us. And I just think the way the world is now is just so different to how we began, and we need to acknowledge that, and, you know, that's today.
A short while ago, the eminent wildlife broadcaster Sir David Attenborough appeared before a live audience in a celebration of his life and work in a special edition of One Planet.
I mean, I didn't start making natural history films with a high-minded idea of saving this, that or the other. I made natural history films because I thought it was the most interesting subject that you could possibly have for a film.
Today was an attempt to enjoy the cultural melting pot of the World Service. The organisation is 80 years old. It's still distinctive, but its role and its sound is evolving quickly. The speed of that change will only quicken.
And the next special programme will be in half an hour when World Business Report and Focus on Africa link up. Now, there is confusion in Egypt over whether a suspect arrested at Cairo airport is a senior Al-Qaeda leader. Egyptian sources say he's Saif al-Adel, one of the most senior figures in Al-Qaeda, but the man himself has strongly denied it, and some counter-terrorism experts have also cast doubt. From Cairo, John Lyne.
The official Egyptian media say the man captured at Cairo airport is Saif al-Adl. That would make him one of the most senior figures in Al-Qaeda, someone wanted for the East Africa bombings in the 1990s and alleged to have played a role in planning the 9/11 attacks. The United States has a $5 million bounty on his head. The Americans, and it seems the Egyptian authorities, believe Saif al-Adl is the pseudonym or nom de guerre of a man whose real name is Mohammed Ibrahim Makawi. The man who's been arrested in Cairo apparently admits he is Mohammed Ibrahim Makawi, but strongly denies he is Saif al-Adl or that he has any links with Al-Qaeda. In fact, he's known as a strident critic of the organisation.
John Lyne in Cairo. Now, a curious story from across the Channel. The Swedish furniture giant Ikea has been accused of secretly accessing police files to spy on customers and staff at its stores in France. The company is alleged to have paid private security firms to carry out the check on 200 people. 10 Ikea employees are planning to issue a formal complaint. From Paris, Christian Fraser reports.
Ikea is a company with a stringent code of conduct for its suppliers, but less stringent, it seems, for the security firms it has employed here in France. Their head of security paid over $100 a time for secret police files held on a criminal database. Over 200 people were investigated, with requests for criminal record and vehicle registration checks, though one email calls for information on someone thought to have made anti-globalisation remarks, someone who'd raised concerns internally of a possible eco-terrorist attack. It's reported the information was used in deciding whether to fire staff members and also in resolving disputes with certain customers. In response, the company told the BBC that Ikea has now opened a full investigation to bring to light all relevant information. We strongly disapprove, said a spokesman, of any illegal activity which impinges on important values like the respect of privacy. Illegal access to these files carries a penalty of up to $400,000 and 5 years in prison.
Over the past few days here on World Briefing, we have been reporting extensively on the Russian presidential election, which is coming up on Sunday, and on why there is consensus that Vladimir Putin is a shoo-in to win, maybe even in the first round. Yet technically, Russia's strongman faces opposition from a field of several other candidates. Here's Steve Rosenberg in Moscow.
The political system which Vladimir Putin built is often called managed democracy, which is why elections here feel staged managed. Take this presidential election. Mr. Putin is running against 4 other candidates, but the suspicion is that the only reason the others have been allowed into the race is because Mr. Putin knows he can beat them. So, who are they? Firebrand nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky lost his temper this week on TV. He's promised that if he wins, he'll rename the post of president Russian Tsar, set up a secret police force to fight enemies of the state. He also intends to clone himself to make sure there's another Vladimir Zhirinovsky to continue his work. The communist Gennady Zyuganov has been defending Joseph Stalin and promising to renationalize some Russian industries. Social Democrat Sergei Mironov styles himself as an icebreaker who can push Russia to a better future, but he's struggling to shake off the reputation of being Putin's friend. Finally, there's the pro-business oligarch Mikhail Prokhorov, the wealthiest and, at 6 foot 8 inches, the tallest presidential candidate. These supporters are singing, "The tallest one will go places." But none of Mr. Putin's 4 rivals is expected to go all the way to the Kremlin. In my travels across Russia ahead of the election, so many people have told me they see no alternative to Vladimir Putin. And that is exactly the result this system is designed to achieve.
Steve Rosenberg. And our main news again, North Korea has agreed to suspend uranium enrichment and testing of long-range missiles. More in our summary next. You've been listening to World Briefing from the BBC World Service.
BBC.
The rules were strict.
My view was that it would be 5, possibly 6 countries that would start. Never occurred to me that Italy or Spain, let alone Greece, would qualify.
But some found ways around the rules.
We used to call him the magician because he made inflation disappear, and then he also made the deficits disappear.
The BBC's Alan Little gets to the roots of the crisis in the European Union.
This crisis has made even more fraught a very old tension in Europe. How long will it be before national populations start to say, wait a minute?
Europe's Choice. Online from the 6th of March at bbcworldservice.com.
Today, the World Service is turning itself inside out. We meet the people behind the news to mark our 80 years of international radio. One world, one day.